Thank you, Francis, and good morning, all. Alexandra, you're an impossible act to follow. I've been a practitioner in the freshwater environment all my life, trying to reconcile between the needs of people and the needs of the environment, and growing progressively more depressed over the decades I've worked in water, as I see the freshwater environment progressively more degraded by death by 1,000 cuts. But I think what you showed us was that there is always hope, but hope must be accompanied by action. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to outline what it is that we can do as decision makers in terms of delivering action in order to ensure not just that people are able to cope in a planet where water is under such stress, but also the freshwater environment gets its fair share of the water and is restored to the health that it deserves to have. And we've talked a lot about the freshwater challenge, but we've never actually, so far in this forum, specified what the problem is that we're trying to solve. Quenching the world's thirst is a great strapline, but it doesn't set out the problem, because it means different things to different people. And those different things may require different solutions. So, for example, water for agriculture, or water for manufacturing, or water for people, whether they're in a megacity or a tiny village, or everything in between, each of their needs will require probably a different solution. But what complicates water management, as you all know, is that water connects everything. So a solution to one problem may have the potential to solve other problems and challenges as well, but it also has the problem to create unforeseen consequences. So we need to be very clear about what it is that we want to achieve, but be alert to the wider context as we're taking decisions and making investments in order to secure a water future for humanity. And the trouble is, it's easier to talk about the problem that we know today because it's staring us in the face. We think we might know what the problem looks like in 10 years' time, but what will the challenge look like in 20, 40, 50, 100 years' time? And recognizing that investing in water is a long-term business, literally, how do we ensure that what we do today, that the investment decisions we make, are fit for purpose for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? Because the problem is that the past is no guide to the future. We live in a dynamic world in which future climate, future water availability, future environmental needs, and human demands for water are, as Francis said, uncertain. But also how people value water is changing, and I think will continue to change. So sort of getting down to business, if you like, let's take the case of a municipality that's struggling to maintain a reliable supply of water to all its residents and businesses. First of all, what do we mean by reliable? What's a reliable supply of water? Is it no matter how severe the drought, the taps keep running? But that will come at a cost if you're delivering to that level of service. Or do we accept that reliable comes with an acceptable level of failure, 1 year in 10, 1 year in 20, 1 year in 50, and plan and invest accordingly? So what's acceptable? And in terms of that level of reliability, should that be for all water users in the city? Or do you have a hierarchy of users with the most essential needs, however you define what the most essential need is, having the highest standard of service? Now, these are not, or in my view certainly shouldn't be, decisions made by technocrats, people like me. They're decisions for policymakers and politicians with good advice, who can consider how to manage the range of trade-offs and reconcile between competing or even conflicting interests. And all of this needs a governance regime which has a clear focus on inclusivity, because all this ultimately involves people, and is clear about the desired outcomes, and also what resources will be needed to deliver those outcomes. And good governance is absolutely critical. And over the last 10 years or so, I've been privileged to work with my friend Gonzalo de la Camara and colleagues at the OECD on the Global Water Governance Initiative. And I think Gonzalo will touch on that later this morning in his presentation. But besides good governance, or within it, we also need a robust regulatory regime. And as an ex-regulator, you might expect me to say that. But we need strong regulation, not just to look after the interests of people and the environment, but it also provides certainty and stability and reassurance to investors. So, pity the poor policymaker, if you will, trying to work out what action and investment is needed for water security. First of all, he or she will need to decide on the planning horizon. How far ahead are you planning to ensure water security within the parameters of all the uncertainties that I'll outline in a moment? You begin by thinking and needing to understand, do you actually understand what's going on at the moment? Do you understand the levels of withdrawal from the freshwater environment, whether it's from rivers or lakes or from groundwater? Are you monitoring and managing those to understand those volumes? Do you understand how much water you've got, actually, within the freshwater environment? And do you understand how close you are to safe environmental limits, or whether you've exceeded them? And then, looking to the future, do you understand how demand for water might grow? How will it change over time? How will the population grow or possibly reduce? Whereabouts in your country will those people be living? How much water will they be consuming? What do you make in terms of assumptions for economic growth? How much water will industry need, manufacturing, services, data centers, and agriculture? So how do you allow for those future demands and the changes in those demands? And not least, of course, in the face of climate change, how will water availability change over time? How will pollution change over time and render now potentially useful water resources into ones which become unusable because of the level of pollution? And it's not just the amount of water that's out there for us to exploit that matters. How much water will the environment need in the future? Recognizing that, if you're a fish or an invertebrate living in a river, what's happening is the way the flow regime is changing, the temperature of the fresh water is changing, and what is currently livable for you now might not be in 2 or 3 decades hence. So new species will move in, existing species will die or move north if they can, which they probably can't. And if the environment is currently impacted by abstraction, do you just accept that and say, well, we'll try not to make it any worse? Or do you say, no, we're going to restore the current environment by returning water to the environment as well as finding more water for people? And finally, back to my original point, what level of service do you want to provide to people in the cities? And what level of service do you want to provide to the environment during a drought, so that you minimize your impact when it's at its most vulnerable? So for each of these questions about the future, there will be more than one assumption. You'll have to create a range of assumptions and turn those into a number of different scenarios in order to test your options for maintaining water supplies or for restoring the environment against each of those different scenarios. And those will need to be a mix of solutions which balance risks, minimize the chance of stranded assets, and minimize the chance of a single point of failure. So the biggest challenge we're facing is not absolute water scarcity, but uncertainty, how we manage uncertainty. So fundamentally, how much water is needed, where, by when, and for what purpose. And we can learn from past experience and Colleagues in the past have always done their best to get it right in terms of planning for water resources, but it's good to think that we know a little more than they did, but we shouldn't be arrogant about what we know and critically what we don't know. So there's a lovely example from the UK where in the 1960s, in the UK it was a time of great optimism. We had the Beatles, we had economic growth, believe it or not, and manufacturing in the UK was booming. And in the northeast of England in particular, we had a steel manufacturing, a wider manufacturing industry, we produced chemicals, and the government at the time believed that that would continue to grow for decades to come. So what we needed was a massive new reservoir to support that growth, to ensure we were fit for the future, for the 21st century. And to the credit of the forecasters and my predecessors, they got it absolutely right. Manufacturing demand, steel-making demand, chemical demand did all increase. The trouble is, it increased in China and India and Europe and not in the northeast of England because we couldn't compete with those other countries. So now we have arguably the world's largest and most expensive boating lake, which is great for canoeing on or walking round, but is hardly used for water supply. It's a wonderful resource, massively underused, because we didn't think about scenario planning, asking those what-if questions. Now, the more we understand about natural processes and the way in which humanity has disrupted them, the more we're seeing greater uncertainty and complexity needing to be added into our decision-making. We're seeing rising expectations from the people whom we serve. We're seeing increasingly complex institutional and financial frameworks. And we're also better recognizing how water links to so many other sectors that we need to think about them as well and not just take water in isolation. And so in this plan that we make based on these scenarios and a range of options for minimizing the risk of failure, we're left with two challenges. The first, an obvious one, is that the future will turn out differently to how we forecast. Think about Kielder Reservoir in the northeast of England. Our assumptions on future demand will be wrong. They might be very wrong or only slightly wrong, but they will be wrong. But how different they're wrong and how different our assumptions on climate change are will determine when we need to repeat that planning process at set trigger points when some of those uncertainties materialize into greater certainty. So we need to ensure that our planning becomes adaptive for the future and clearer. The second challenge is that no matter how good our plan is, at some point, you will find yourself in a drought worse than anything you have planned for. And I know that some of you in the room have shared my experience of knowing that feeling when you're watching the contents of your reservoir literally evaporate. Your reservoir's progressively emptying, groundwater levels progressively declining, and there's no sign of rain. Now, it's slightly less nerve-wracking if you have a drought plan already in place. A drought plan in which you've pre-agreed your options, what you do in extremis, the trade-offs and the tough decisions that you will make during a drought, and to put it bluntly, what do you protect and what do you sacrifice in a catastrophic drought? Because in a drought, views on the values of water and how you prioritize its use may be different to normal circumstances. In fact, they almost certainly will be. Preservation of public health is likely to be paramount, almost regardless of what that might do in terms of ensuring public health might do to the environment or to industry or agriculture. You might do your very best to manage the demand for public water supply, but nonetheless, something else will have to give down the way. And just very briefly, it's important to recognize that no longer is managing water just about quantity, it's also about quality. And we've talked briefly, thanks to Alexandra, about the cocktail of pollutants that we're finding in rivers and ultimately in oceans. The more we sample, the more we find, and the more disturbing it gets in terms of microplastics, PFAS, metals, pharmaceuticals, antimicrobial resistance, and pathogens. And I was at a meeting recently with Sir Chris Whitty, the UK's Chief Medical Officer, and he was asked, well, what's your big concern for the future? Is it another COVID? And his view was, no, because we can learn from the past COVID pandemic. His concern was antimicrobial pathogens growing within the freshwater environment as a result of what we're pouring into the environment through our sewage. So pathogens developing antimicrobial resistance, forming the next potential global pandemic. And we know how much untreated sewage is going into the environment, and we know that that contains pharmaceuticals, and we have no idea what that's doing cumulatively and in combination to the natural environment or indeed to ourselves. And in the UK, there's a growing public anger about sewage pollution. You may well have seen it in the media, and I'm happy to talk about that. But that anger far outweighs the reality of the scale of the risk or its impact. But it does reflect how society now views water as something which is more than just a resource to be exploited. It's valued increasingly for its life-giving properties and its benefits to well-being, and for cultural and spiritual reasons, including by indigenous communities whose needs we have so often overlooked in the past when we're managing water. Now, the task of water professionals is to ensure secure supplies of water, of the right quality, of the right quantity, to support society, the economy, human health, and to protect the environment. So those are the givens for people in my profession. But there's something more that we need to consider increasingly, and that's to better understand how people view and value water and what they see as the priorities for how it should be used and managed, and their views on how it's abused and mismanaged. And to recognise that the valuations they put on water may be just as valid, if not more so, than those put on water by economists. Sorry to all the economists in the room, but we need to listen to people. And reconciling those emotional connections with the prosaic business of supplying water and dealing with wastewater can only be done by engaging with communities as people like me develop plans for secure water supplies. Now, water professionals talk a lot about intergenerational investment, not least because we owe so much to what our predecessors have done for us. But we need to recognise that the people whom we serve, their expectations are changing. And at the moment, I don't think they will thank us for what we're not doing at the moment in terms of looking after the environment and planning for secure water supplies for the future. They will expect us to be doing much more than we are currently. And this forum is all about tapping into innovation, and innovation will certainly have a place to play in meeting the needs of a thirsty global population. But at events like this, it's easy to fall into a trap, which is to treat the challenge simply as an abstract, intellectual, financial, and engineering problem. But we also need to innovate in a different way. To innovate in terms of how we define and assess the problem we're trying to solve. To innovate in terms of how we plan for the future for water security. And innovate in terms of how we govern a scarce and uncertain resource. And innovate in terms of how we listen to the people whom we serve. Thank you.